I look rough as BALM. We're like a week and a bit in, and October is already doing a number on me. Oh, one of my candles fell down. Not that you can see. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and I paint crap on my face. We've started the video off with glasses, gross hair, and this, which can only mean one thing. I'm talking myths, I'm talking monsters, and makeup. I need to sort my intro out, man. Yes, we are back with another spooky season special of monsters, myths, and makeup. I hope you guys appreciate how much brain power it takes to say that one sentence. I've really been enjoying doing like the spookier episodes of this for October. I still have a few more in the bag, so make sure you are subscribed, notification bells on, all that generic self-promo stuff so that you don't miss any of the uploads. Last week, we spoke about the Halloween game and the legend surrounding Bloody Mary. Today we're going to be looking at something that's not necessarily like Halloween specific, and it's more of a horror thing. Because as I was planning out some of the ideas that I had for the 31 looks of October, I realised I really wanted to do like the classic creepy haunted doll. And obviously the one that always comes to mind with that, especially for things like Halloween costumes, is Annabelle. I know Annabelle is based on a real doll, but I didn't know too much about said real doll. So inevitably I started doing a bit of research, fell down a rabbit hole, and now I have 9 pages worth of notes to talk about. So strap in. But yeah, we're going to be having a little look at kind of the legacies associated with classic dolls, where the concept kind of comes from, as well as a few real life cases of allegedly haunted dolls. So before I waffle on for too much longer, let me go get prepped and we can get started. For those of you who are interested to know what makeup products I use, they will all be listed in the description box. One other thing, just before I get too distracted and lose track of what I'm doing, I know last week my Bloody Mary episode was like a little bit on the shorter side compared to the other videos that I've done, and not gonna lie, this one is looking like it's potentially going to be a bit of a longer one. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, what kind of video length do you prefer? Do you prefer like the shorter sort of like 20-25 minute videos, or would you be happy with deeper dives and longer videos going up to like 40 minutes or even up to an hour, that kind of thing? A lot of this stuff is kind of dependent on what the information is and the stories involved in it. Like I said with the Medusa one, anything to do with like Greek mythology or anything like that, you can talk about that for hours. But other topics, like, they're a bit more limited. So let me know in the comments if you would prefer longer videos going like even further into lore and history and backstory, that kind of thing, or if you would rather they were a bit on the shorter side. Now, haunted, creepy looking dolls are a staple, a classic trope used within horror movies and the paranormal, usually along the lines of like demonic possessions or curses, spirits, that kind of thing. There are some very well-known examples of haunted dolls in like mainstream media that have really increased the popularity of the whole idea, and you're looking at things like Annabelle, but also things like Chucky, which I know they're kind of, the way they're presented is kind of two ends of like a weird spectrum, because, you know, Annabelle is terrifying and Chucky's Chucky, man. The concept of Chucky is terrifying, but obviously the idea of a haunted doll is not just limited to film and TV, because there are several examples and notable real-life cases of apparent possession, including, possibly the most well-known, which is Annabelle. And whilst the like specific concept of a haunted or possessed doll is actually still a fairly modern idea, the idea of a creepy doll is much older. Now, dolls themselves have been around for thousands of years, dating back to some of the earliest civilizations like Egypt, Rome, and Greece. Back in 2004, there was an historic dig in an island in the Mediterranean, and they unearthed a 4,000-year-old stone doll. And there are some history museums that have examples of ancient Egyptian rag dolls, which were linen stuffed with like papyrus. Now obviously thousands of years ago, dolls like that would have been made by hand, and the modern manufacturing techniques of doll making were rooted in Germany in sort of the 15th century. Then after industrialization and the availability of new materials like porcelain and then eventually plastic, dolls became much more sort of mass produced to the point that they are today. This looks horrifying. This looks so creepy already. First little weird creepy fun fact of the video. I found somewhere that stated in 18th century Europe, parents would hang wax dolls in their children's bedrooms in order to basically scare them into staying in their rooms at night. And apparently it became known as doll torture or doll hanging, which is just horrifying. It's like an indoor scarecrow for children. Now, obviously, a lot of the earliest dolls are rag dolls, and it wasn't until the 19th century, when dolls were becoming more popular in sort of Europe and North America, that children began collecting porcelain dolls instead of rag dolls. And this was generally because, obviously, they looked a lot nicer and they tended to cost more money. During this time as well, dolls became really, really popular gifts to give to young girls because obviously they reinforced the gender stereotypes that were in place at the time. They taught girls how to knit and sew, how to socialise with their babies. Obviously, this was from a time where girls were expected to become wives and homemakers, so dolls were often given as gifts with the idea of having this like instructional function to them. Although it was actually later on in the 19th century that the general designs of dolls started to change, because there was a big shift in mindset of like how parents viewed their children. Because it was basically around this time that parents started to view their children as children rather than like unfinished adults that needed to be brought up to speed with the rest of the adults. They started to think of childhood as a time of innocence and play, and that it was something to be like cherished and protected, not like rushed out of. So in turn, a lot of like dolls' faces started to take on this much more angelic, sort of rounded face, like cherub-like appearance. Now, the fear of dolls does have a proper name. I believe it's pronounced pediophobia. Pediophobia? And it's classified under the broader term of, automatonophobia? I think I have enough syllables in there. Which is a fear of like humanoid figures. And it's also linked to the fear of puppets, which is Popophobia? I don't know. Phobia names are just, they're weird, man. Now, whilst a genuine phobia of dolls can be caused by things like traumatic events during childhood or negative exposure to dolls, it is often considered an irrational fear, albeit intense, and like many phobias, it can be completely debilitating for the people who suffer from it. However, many people who get like freaked out by dolls, they don't have the phobia. It's more of like a easy to laugh it off, kind of jokey, like, oh, I don't like them, I can't look at them. And it's often a very sort of like culturally reinforced sense of unease that people seem to get around them. Again, due to things like films like Annabelle and Chucky and the horror stories that surround the idea of creepy dolls. And as I said, a lot of people can kind of dismiss it in a very jokey way of, oh, I don't like them, they freak me out. So it's more accurate to say that dolls in general, albeit not all dolls, they don't really frighten people so much as they just creep people out. Okay, I had to do the line work off camera really quickly just because I've not quite managed the art of doing it on camera at the moment. But yeah, generally speaking, most people find dolls unnerving and just a bit creepy. Now, what can actually make dolls feel like inherently creepy and unnerving to people is often based in psychology, and it's a lot to do with what your brain perceives as threatening. It's linked very closely with the idea of things being uncanny, and it leans into the sort of the uncanny valley territory of things, because there are two main factors that explain why we would find something creepy, which is familiarity. Something being familiar, but also ambiguous. Basically, dolls look lifelike and familiar. They have human-like faces, but they have no emotion. And it's that grey area that is what gives your brain the creeps, because obviously as humans, we rely very heavily on facial expression and that open display of emotion. So basically when you look at a doll, the very, very like primitive primal part of your brain registers that it is a face, i.e. another person, but because there is no emotion on it whatsoever, you can't you can't read it, you can't get any kind of response from it. So your brain can't quite work out if it's a threat or not. There was a psychologist who put out a paper in 2013 of a working hypothesis of what creepy actually means, and it basically just all comes down to uncertainty. And he basically described it in the way that, like, if something is frightening, you scream, you run away from it. If something is disgusting, you know how to react to it, you know what to do. But if something is creepy, that, like, ambiguity, it might be dangerous, but you're not sure that it is, but you can't, there's something off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. There's actually a toy museum in London that has its own dedicated doll room, and I mean, they've got like rag dolls, wax dolls, porcelain dolls, Victorian dolls, dolls from like Japan and China. Like, they got a lot of dolls. And the doll room is the last room before the museum's exit. The museum has actually reported that quite a lot of their visitors cannot make it through that room. They can't manage it. So they instead trek all the way back through the museum to the entrance rather than go through that room and exit. One of the people who works at the museum, who's worked there for like over 7 years, they did an interview with them, and they said it's usually the adults who get freaked out the most by that room. Children, generally speaking, absolutely fine with it. They can handle it, no problem. And they noticed that it happened more often during the winter, when obviously it got darker outside earlier, so that room was just that like little bit darker as well. And he described it that people were behaving as if they'd just come out of like a haunted house rather than a museum. Now, whilst dolls are primarily intended as toys for children, even thousands of years ago, I don't know how they know this, but even thousands of years ago in places like Greece and Rome and Egypt, the dolls that were made were often given to children as playthings. But there are iterations of like dolls and figurines that have been used by different cultures and countries for various reasons over thousands of years. Now, going back to ancient Egypt for a second, they had something that were called puppets. Now, there are more modern versions of this as well, but they were used in ceremonies to rid the body of any evil in order that someone's soul could be sent to God after death. However, most puppets were then actually used to place curses on people, similar to the idea of like a voodoo doll, and the dolls would then sort of latch themselves onto the soul of the person they were supposed to be cursing. I think this is one of the most trust the process looks I have done in a very long time. Now, puppets themselves kind of fall under their own category of doll, and they're often used a lot in like folk magic and witchcraft, and they're generally made to represent a specific person in order to cast spells on them or to aid them through the use of magic. And they're made from like all sorts of different materials. All over the world, each culture generally has their own variation of a puppet, and the intentions and motivations for making them, as well as the materials that are most often used, again, will just vary greatly depending on where you go. There were a few notable examples that I found of like different cultures having their own sort of puppets, one of which was the German kitchen witch. Now, the idea of a kitchen witch is to bring good sort of energy and good intentions into a home kitchen and help prevent kitchen disasters such as undercooked food or burnt food. But it's believed in order for a kitchen witch to work, a small ritual or prayer has to be done beforehand. And it's all based on the idea that the kitchen was one of the most important rooms in the home because it was a source of remedies and the nutrition that was needed to maintain the body. Within folk magic and witchcraft, that kind of thing, there were a whole host of other different types of puppet as well. Things like love puppets, prosperity puppets, healing, protection, and a whole bunch of other puppets, and each one was like created and infused with different items that were relevant to the purpose of that puppet. I remember, for example, I think the protection puppet had like sage infused with it, because often sage is used within witchcraft to cleanse and protect. There are a lot of other items from different cultures as well that were kind of linked to puppets and these types of things. So I saw reference to things like corn dollies or corn mothers, which were like an old sort of straw figurine type thing that were made as part of like harvest customs in Europe. You've got corn husk dolls from Native America, and there's a doll that I don't know how it's pronounced, I'm really sorry. Hoko but it's given to young women of age and pregnant women in Japan in order to offer protection to the woman and child. So obviously dolls do have a very long sort of cultural history of being associated with rituals and magic, not just as children's toys. Demonic or spiritual possession also has a very long cultural history, with a huge number of variations of it being found in pretty much any culture that you can think of. So both things have existed for thousands of years across the world, but the specific idea of a haunted doll, or at least in the terms that we tend to think of today, is actually still a fairly modern thing. Now, when you hear the term haunted doll, most people tend to think of the old, like, Victorian-esque dolls with, like, big dresses and loads of ruffles and the creepy porcelain faces. But the concept of malevolent dolls didn't really gain any attention until the 20th century, thanks to the film and entertainment industry. Because it was during this time that the industry were able to realistically portray safely inanimate dolls as dangerously animate. Animate? Is that right? That doesn't sound right. Now, the very earliest example of this was a film released in 1936 called The Devil Doll, and it was adapted from a novel called Burn Witch Burn, and the film itself has become a bit of like a cult film. To summarise, in relation to like haunted dolls, there's this like French scientist who's worried about human overpopulation, so he develops a formula to shrink humans down in order to preserve the resources that we have available. But the formula ends up in the hands of an escaped prisoner who was wrongfully convicted. He basically goes on like a revenge mission to use this formula on the people who landed him in jail. The specific relevance that I found is that there's a bit where the escaped prisoner disguises himself as like an old woman selling these lifelike dolls at a market stall, when in reality it's people. Now, possibly the most notable early example of the possessed doll trope as we know it today was an episode of The Twilight Zone that aired in 1963, centred on a dysfunctional family who buy their young daughter a wind-up doll called Talkie Tina. Now, interestingly, the mother in this family is called Annabelle. Also, the Talkie Tina doll was based on a real doll that was out at the time called Chatty Cathy. The doll's name is Christy, and during the episode, the stepfather is like really, really hostile to Christy and the doll. Now, obviously, the doll was one of those wind-up ones that made noises and said phrases, and where it originally started out by saying things like, "My name is Talkie Tina, I love you," those kind of lines, it suddenly started saying things like, "I don't like you," to the stepfather when he was alone. Now, the stepfather is convinced that it's like an issue with the manufacturer, or maybe it's his wife playing some kind of elaborate trick on him as a way of kind of getting him back for being hostile toward their daughter. But the doll gradually begins engaging in more like elaborate conversations with him, and he ends up trying to throw the doll away. But he then receives a phone call where he hears the doll's voice threatening to kill him. So obviously he gets this phone call, he freaks out, so he goes back to the bin to try and retrieve the doll, but, as I'm sure you can guess, the doll is not there. So he goes back inside the house and he finds that the doll is safely tucked up in bed with young Christy. Throughout the course of the episode, the stepfather tries like numerous different ways to get rid of this doll, including like putting it in a vice, using a blowtorch on it, even like a circular saw, but none of it works. So he puts it in a burlap sack, puts it in the bin, and puts like weights on the lid so that it can't get out. Now at this point, Annabelle, the mother, is just packing everything up to leave. She's packing up Christy and all their things, basically telling the stepfather, like, no, you need professional help. This has got too far now. The stepfather obviously panics and doesn't want them to leave, so he offers to retrieve the doll and give it back to Christy if it means that they'll stay. Annabelle ends up agreeing to stay, so the stepfather goes to retrieve the doll and, true to his word, he gives it back to Christy. Now, that night, he hears a noise, so he goes into Christy's room to check on her, but the doll isn't there. Then, when he goes downstairs, he trips on the doll and ends up suffering fatal injuries. Then, when Annabelle comes down and finds his body next to the doll says, "My name is Talkie Tina, and you'd better be nice to me." So at which point, Anna freaks out and realises the whole thing was true. The closing narration of the episode basically states, we know dolls can't talk, they can't really murder people, But to a child caught in the middle of disruption, disorder, a dysfunctional home, a doll or a toy can become a friend or a guardian or a defender. Now, this episode of The Twilight Zone went on to be parodied, like, a lot by a number of different TV shows. Obviously, it was featured and parodied in an episode of The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horrors. There was an episode of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and even an episode of Johnny Bravo. Talkie Tina was also the inspiration behind the character of Gabby Gabby in Toy Story 4, which, fun, disturbing little fact. So despite the origins of the haunted doll seeming to come from sort of film and TV rather than any particular folklore or legend, there are a number of real-life claims around haunted dolls. The success of the films around this idea led to a huge rise in sales of dolls that were claimed to be haunted or possessed or cursed on places like eBay and Amazon and Etsy. Like, you can literally still find people today listing haunted dolls for sale on those sites. I mean, it's like Facebook Marketplace as well. You can find people selling haunted dolls. I think of all of those things, I would trust Facebook Marketplace the least for buying any kind of haunted doll. Like, for the possibility of something actually being wrong with it. I don't know what. Facebook Marketplace just gives me weird vibes in that regard. There was actually a folklore professor who, for starters, dream job, who said that, like, ghost tours, adverts for haunted hotels, and any other kind of monetary transaction build on these pre-existing beliefs and narratives that come from folklore. And the fact that people buy and sell, like, ghostly material doesn't take anything away from the material's value for folklore researchers. If I'm kind of interpreting correctly, it's basically them just saying, like, because it's been sort of commercialized doesn't take away from the relevance that it still has to things like folklore and legends and history. Obviously, as I said before, one of the most well-known cases of a real-life haunted doll is Annabelle. Annabelle is quite a well-known doll in that regard anyway, due to the connection to Ed and Lorraine Warren, which we'll come to later, but mainly due to the character's portrayal and depiction in the Conjuring film universe franchise. But there are other haunted dolls that have become infamous in their own right, including what is believed to be the oldest example, known as Robert, or Robert the Doll. I got eyeshadow on the side of my nose and I didn't realise, and I've kind of blended it in now, and I'm very upset about it. Oh well. Robert, or Robert the Doll, is an allegedly haunted doll that is currently exhibited at a museum in Key West in Florida, and is often referred to as Key West's most cursed item. The doll originally belonged to someone named Robert Eugene Otto, who was described as a very eccentric artist. He was part of quite a prominent family in Key West. It's believed the doll was manufactured in Germany by the same company that actually manufactured the very first teddy bear in honour of Theodore Roosevelt. One little fact there. Now, it's actually believed that Robert the doll was actually never intended to be sold as a toy. He was most likely part of a set that was created for a window display of, like, clowns or jesters, but he was bought by Otto's grandfather during a trip to Germany in 1904 and was then given to Otto when he was young. And it's actually believed that, like, the little sailor's suit that the doll wears would have belonged to Otto and been a suit that he had worn as a child, because the company didn't supply that outfit at all. I just noticed photos of, like, the film Annabelle doll, where it's obviously meant to be all, like, old and weathered. The blush is a little bit, like, splotchy in places, so I'm going to try and go for that. Now, is it just going to look like I haven't blended it? Probably. Oh, actually, I don't know. I feel like it kind of works, maybe. Anyway, whilst Otto was given the doll when he was a child, his relationship with the doll continued well on to adulthood for him, in a way that many people would have described as unhealthy. He would reportedly take the doll everywhere with him. He would talk about it in the first person as if it was a real person, and just generally treated it like a living being rather than a doll. Now, according to legend, Otto began blaming all of his, like, childhood mishaps on the doll. Now obviously this could have probably just been brushed off as like childish storytelling or an overactive imagination. However, adults in his life did begin to notice some kind of weird stuff start happening, especially as Otto and the doll got older. Now, I did find one, like, weirdly detailed story about a particular instance of something weird happening. So, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily know how true or accurate it is, but it was in reference to the first odd thing that happened in that one night, Otto, when he was around 10 years old, woke up to see Robert, the doll, sitting at the foot of his bed. Just a few moments later, Otto's mother woke up to the sound of her son just screaming, and the sound of like furniture being like moved and shifted and like upended in his room. And when they were finally able to get the door open, they found Otto curled up on his bed, like screaming and crying, and Robert sitting at the foot of the bed. And Otto's response to this was, "Robert did it," which apparently was a phrase that he then went on to use a lot, which honestly kind of reminds me of Drop Dead Fred. But apparently his parents would hear Otto upstairs talking to Robert, but they would hear him get a response in like a completely different voice, which, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that the doll is alive and possessed. I mean, I used to do like voices for my toys when I was a kid, so now Otto went off to study art in New York and then Paris, during which time Robert the doll stayed at the family home. Otto then later married and moved back to the family home, which he called the artist house. After Otto had moved back in, Robert could often be seen sitting in the upstairs window, as Otto claimed that Robert needed his own room. And from there, school children started sharing stories about how the doll would disappear and then reappear. The story spread really quickly, and school children especially just generally started avoiding that house in general. Otto passed away in 1974, followed shortly by his wife about 2 years later, and the home, still containing the doll, was then sold. The new resident lived at that house for about 20 years. However, during that time, visitors to the house swore that they could hear footsteps in the attic, as well as like giggling sounds, and some of them claimed that Robert's expression would change if he badmouthed Otto in front of him. The homeowner also stated that Robert would like move about the house on his own, and basically after 20 years of his shenanigans, they were done. So they donated the doll to the museum in Key West in 1994. Now, as we've discussed previously, with pretty much any legend, urban legend, folk story, anything like that, there are a number of variations depending on who you ask. And the case is still true for this, including the origin of the doll in the first place. Some people believe that the doll was given to Otto by a young girl from the Bahamas, either as a gift or as retaliation for some sort of wrongdoing, while there are others who believe that the doll was given to him by a servant of the estate who had been mistreated by his parents, so as punishment she cursed the doll with voodoo and black magic. Other legends as well would state that the doll would move like voodoo figurines around the room and was aware of what was going on around him, and that the doll vanished after Otto's house changed hands after his death. Now, according to local folklore, Robert has caused car accidents, broken bones, job loss, divorce, and a wide array of other misfortunes. Since his donation to the museum, visitors have flocked there in huge numbers to get a look at him. He's appeared on TV shows, he's a stop on like a ghost tour in the area, he's inspired horror movies, both directly and indirectly. Like, there is a series of films about Robert the doll. He has his own social media accounts, you can buy replicas of the doll, books, t-shirts, coasters, and apparently you can even volunteer to be locked in with Robert in the museum after dark. Now, one of the craziest facts that I read about him in relation to his sort of like infamy within the museum is that museum workers have stated that Robert receives 1 to 3 letters a day. Albeit, most of these are apology letters, because a lot of people who visit the doll in the museum have reported post-museum misfortunes for failing to respect Robert or for openly disrespecting him, so they will often write to him to beg for his forgiveness. People will also write in asking for advice, asking for Robert to hex or curse people who have done them wrong, and according to the museum, they've received over 1,000 letters, all of which are kept and catalogued. No, I creased my eye and it transferred. Now, as well as thousands of letters, obviously in keeping with modern times and his own social media account, Robert also receives emails as well as gifts and donations, money, and apparently even like joints, which the museum have openly said like it's really, really inappropriate because they're a museum at the end of the day. And at some point, it became known that Robert had a sweet tooth, so people began leaving him like sweets and sending him candy. And apparently there was one instance where they received a box containing 8 bags of peppermints, a small card, and no return address. Now, even though this doll is like over 100 years old, you can find like really recent first-hand accounts of people who have been to visit him and what they've experienced and what happened. Like, I literally found a Reddit thread of people discussing their visit to see Robert the doll. Now, obviously, it could all just be coincidence, but the general consensus surrounding Robert is that as long as you are respectful to him, you know, you ask permission before you take any photos, you thank him when you leave, you should be fine. However, some of the examples I found from people who have been to visit him and then experienced these post-visit misfortunes are genuinely a bit eerie. There was one account I found about a man who had visited with his brother and sister-in-law, and whilst he and his sister-in-law had been very respectful, asking permission before taking photos, thanking before they left, all of that kind of stuff, his brother was openly disrespectful to the doll. And immediately after they left the museum, the brother and the sister-in-law got a phone call to say that the plumbing in their rental property had completely backed up. And the guy who had gone to visit his brother and gone to the museum with them, when he returned from that trip, he'd lost his job. And apparently the brother and the sister-in-law got divorced like 6 months later. Things like that, it's like it's a string of unfortunate events. Whether it's connected or it's just a coincidence, it's a little weird, I can't lie, but not all of the tales were quite that dramatic or costly. A lot of them were to do with like weird glitches happening on cameras and videos that had been taken. So there was one where like they'd taken photos of him, but then when they then went to look at the photos later on, they were completely gone. Other cases where the photos had actually duplicated themselves on the SD card but with like different timestamps. Lots of just weird stuff, for lack of a better phrase. There was another tale I saw about a family who had gone to visit the doll, and whilst this family were very respectful, followed all the rules, that kind of thing, they witnessed another family who were openly disrespectful, like mocking him, laughing at him, that kind of thing. Now this first family actually went back in to Robert to apologise for the behaviour of this other group of people and just kind of talk to him a little bit about it and just generally being like, yeah, I'm really sorry about them. And apparently they then heard like a music box start to play for a few minutes, and when they were leaving the museum they mentioned to the staff members about how beautiful the music was, and the staff member explained that the music box in Robert's room hadn't worked for years. The only time that music plays is when Robert is happy. Now, one of the family members didn't believe this at all. He thought it was like a bit of a tourist trap. So he asked the staff member if he could see the sound system. So the staff member showed him, and when he saw it, it was completely covered in dust. And it was very obvious that it hadn't been touched, let alone fixed, for years. Even Ozzy Osbourne has blamed some of his problems with like his health and sort of general bad luck on an interaction that he had with the doll years ago. He initially visited the doll during one of the shows that he did with his son. However, Ozzy did then buy a replica of the doll and blow it up with a water cannon, so he kind of bought it on himself. Now, whilst Robert is like the oldest known haunted doll, it wasn't until his donation to the museum in the 90s that his story really became known beyond sort of local legend. However, 5 years after the release of the Twilight Zone episode, a story was released from the paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren regarding a haunted doll that would go on to become one of the most well-known characters in horror in recent years, which of course was Annabelle. So the original Annabelle, which was a Raggedy Ann doll, was given to a young student nurse by her mother in 1970, who brought it back to her apartment, which she shared with a fellow student nurse. So not long after this, both women began to notice that Annabelle seemed to sort of move in and out of rooms of her own accord, and they then began finding notes around the apartment that said things like, "Help me," and it was written on parchment paper which neither of the women owned. Now at one point, the boyfriend of one of these women was visiting for the afternoon, and he thought he heard noises coming from one of the bedrooms. It sounded like someone trying to break in. Now when he went into the room, he found no signs of forced entry, but he did see the doll lying face down on the floor. And then he suddenly felt like this searing pain on his chest, and he looked down to find bloody claw marks running across it. However, 2 days later, they'd completely disappeared. There is apparently another version of the story where he was attacked after he woke up from a nap by the doll, but either way, the encounter led the two women to invite a medium over to try and explain what was happening. The medium then held a seance and explained that the doll had been possessed by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle, whose body had been found years earlier on the site that the apartment building was situated, and explained that, you know, the spirit was benevolent and just wanted to be loved and cared for. So following this, the two women felt bad for the spirit and for Annabelle, so they allowed her to take permanent residence within the doll. Now, despite accepting the spirit, at some point the two women were trying to get rid of the doll from their home. So they contacted a priest, who then contacted another priest, who then got in touch with the Warrens. Now, the Warrens, they claimed that the problem started when the two women had taken pity on the doll, because they believed it was actually a demonic force that was in search of a human host that had possessed the doll, not this benevolent spirit. Their account of this case stated, and I quote, "Spirits do not possess inanimate objects like houses or toys. They possess people. An inhuman spirit can attach itself to a place or object, and that is what occurred in the Annabelle case. The spirit manipulated the doll and created the illusion of it being alive in order to get recognition. Truly, the spirit was not looking to stay attached to the doll, it was looking to possess a human host." Side note, I need to do the eyebrows, and they're basically just two very thin lines, so I'm going to do them off camera so I don't mess them up. I don't want to talk about it. Now, Ed and Lorraine's claims of demonic possession was based on signs such as teleportation, i.e. the doll moving from room to room, materialization, which is the parchment paper notes, and the mark of the beast being the claw marks on the boyfriend's chest. Hold on, I've not mastered the art of lip lining while talking yet. So following this, they subsequently ordered an exorcism to take place at the apartment, and they then removed the doll. Now, following the exorcism, the Warrens documented several paranormal experiences involving the doll, the first being immediately after they left. Whilst they were driving home with the doll, Lorraine claims that the brakes on the car failed or stalled several times, resulting in near disastrous crashes. But once Ed doused the doll in holy water, all of the problems with the brakes disappeared. Once they arrived home, they initially placed the doll in Ed's study, but they then reported that the doll began to levitate and just move around the house on her own. And even when they placed her in a locked outer building, she would reappear inside the house. They decided to take Annabelle to their occult museum, where, despite the fact that the museum is now closed, she remains to this day inside a locked glass cabinet with several carvings of different prayers and the warning that reads, "Positively do not open." However, even after she was locked away, there were further stories of people who encountered this demonic entity. One was a young priest who had visited and sort of generally dismissed the idea of this demonic creature and the powers of the doll. And when Ed warned him about, don't mock this creature, don't mock this doll, the young priest just laughed him off. However, after leaving, the priest was involved in a near fatal crash which completely totaled his car, and he claims to have seen Annabelle in his rearview mirror just before he crashed. Years later, there was another visitor to the museum who was apparently like tapping on the glass and just laughing about the whole thing and how silly it was that people believed this doll was evil and demonic. But on his way home, he reportedly lost control of his motorbike and crashed. He was killed instantly, but his girlfriend like barely survived, and she stated at the time of the accident they had been laughing about the doll. Now, if you don't know too much about them, Ed and Lorraine Warren have come under huge amounts of scrutiny for their stories and their claims over the years, and generally a lot of people have written them off as like charlatans and con men, especially as they became sort of more and more well known. And the stories about Annabelle are no different, because everything I have just told you about Annabelle the doll has come from them. None of the stories have ever been corroborated. The names of the priest and the motorcyclist who died never been shared. The two nurses from the beginning, they never came forward with their story, and the priests involved with the exorcism, there was no mention of the exorcism from them or anything like that. So many people have dismissed the story of Annabelle in particular as being just another tall tale told by the Warrens that was then hugely popularised by the Conjuring franchise. However, with things like Robert the Doll and the numerous first-hand accounts that are still happening to this day, it's a little bit harder to just dismiss. I've come to like the last section of the story, and I think what I have to do is like the finishing touches of the look. So, 1, I'm getting better at tying this all together, I think. 2, let me just go do some finishing touches, and we can then come back and finish up with the story. Okay, I'm fully aware this is not like a biblically accurate costume for this character, but I realised far too late that I didn't actually have the right kind of costume for this, so I've had to kind of hodgepodge it together a little bit. But moving back to the realm of this but real life. So I did find records and sources to do with several other like notable haunted dolls all across the world. And like I said earlier, like at any given time you can find hundreds of haunted dolls being sold online through various different sites. Now, other than Robert and obviously Annabelle, one of the oldest tales that I found to do with a haunted doll in real life comes from modern Japanese folklore, which centers around a young girl named, bear with me, Okiku. I'm very sorry if I got that wrong, please feel free to correct me. But she received a large doll as a gift from her brother when she was young, and this was in like 1918. So Okiku gave the doll her own name, and when Okiku died, her family believed that her spirit was then inhabiting the doll because the hair on the doll was growing. The doll apparently now resides in a temple, and it's claimed that there is a priest who regularly takes care of the doll and trims the still growing hair. Over in Australia, there was a man who discovered a doll whilst he was visiting an abandoned building in 1972. He named this doll Letter Me Out because of the doll's alleged supernatural abilities, and he claims that people have seen the doll move in front of them, as well as the doll leaving like visible scuff marks around his house. And if I remember correctly, like he's been on TV with this doll quite a few times as well. Over in Canada, there was a porcelain baby doll that was made sometime between 1910 and 1920 named Mandy. Mandy was donated to a museum in 1991 after, again, claims that it possessed supernatural abilities. And apparently the doll's eyes are meant to follow museum visitors whenever they walk around. And interestingly enough, I found a big bunch of articles that were released in August of this year, so just a couple of months ago, about a haunted doll in South Yorkshire here in the UK that allegedly has like a hatred towards men, having attacked over 17 of them. So the doll is called Elizabeth because, of course, I believe she's like a bridal doll, or I've seen her referred to as a bridal doll, so she's wearing like a wedding dress. While she's only caused physical injuries to men, she has never harmed a woman, and she seems to hold like no hostility towards women at all. So the owners of the doll, one of whom is a paranormal investigator, believe that the spirit that is inhabiting this doll is potentially like a jilted bride or someone who was mistreated by a man during her lifetime. The doll allegedly attacks men that visit her in the museum that she's kept in, causing things like scratch marks and in some cases like a burning sensation around the neck. But the owners claim that she's also capable of setting off fire alarms, throwing perfume bottles across the room, causing weird glitchy video interference. And the owner of the museum and the doll has stated that he believes one of the reasons the doll is acting out so much, like at the moment, is because the museum has recently acquired a few items from the Conjuring franchise, which has driven some of the museum's visitors' attentions away from her. Therefore, she is acting out of jealousy. He's also been quoted as saying that he believes this is the most haunted doll in the world. Any articles that I find relating to this are literally from like 2 months ago. I found there was one article that was published 3 days ago prior to me filming this. So this feels like a very, very new story because I'd never heard of it before. So it will be interesting to follow that particular story and see how it holds up sort of later on down the line, because I mean, attacking 17 men and being the most haunted doll in the world, like that's a fairly big claim. But what do you guys think? Do you think there is any kind of truth to this idea of like haunted dolls, or is it local legends playing on the inherently creepy and unnerving nature of dolls? Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever had an experience with a haunted doll, or if you've ever been to see one of them in the museums. I would love to know your experiences with it, because like I said, it's very interesting reading the first-hand accounts of people who have interacted with these items. I don't personally find dolls that creepy. Like the stereotypical dolls that people find really creepy and unnerving, the ones that are made to look creepy specifically for things like horror films and stuff like that, they do unnerve me a little bit, but that's kind of the point. But like dolls in general, I don't. Let me know your guys' thoughts as well. Dolls, yay, nay, creepy? Let me know as well any other myths and monsters and legends that you would like me to cover in the future. I do still have a few more episodes planned for the rest of October. Let me know what you think of the look as well. It was a journey. I've never done a look like this with this kind of level of like shading and contouring, so I am actually quite happy with how it's turned out. Other than that, thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you all have a fabulous day. Why did I say it like that? Other than that, I will see you all in the next one. Bye. I can't decide if I look creepy or just really dumb.